when we do our spiritual practice, particularly when we do meditation, mindfulness meditation in particular, we loosen our sense of everyday self. In our functional mode, or doing mode, our sense of self is kind of like a fist. We have a particular set of beliefs and feelings, attitudes, memories, and so forth, that we say is me. This is who I am. And in our meditation practice, in our spiritual practices, this sense of me becomes more open, more relaxed. And so we become aware of aspects of our consciousness that we did not necessarily know existed before. Some of these elements are what psychologists would call transpersonal. They're elements that are beyond the personal self, perhaps even beyond time and space as we know it. We open up to a much larger and more spacious and a more fluid and dynamic sense of self. And as we open up, there may be times, in fact it happens more often than not, when we begin to experience unhealed, unfinished business, if you will, from the past, what psychologists would call pre-personal, that come out of our personal history, perhaps long before we can remember. These particular qualities, these energies that have been repressed for a long time, are broadly called in today's psychopop the shadow. And the shadow basically means anything that has been a part of our experience, but we have repressed it for some reason. Typically because it's been painful or anxiety producing, and or simply out of sync with who we think we are. So when the shadow experiences arise in our meditation practice, oftentimes we're unpleasantly surprised. We might say to ourselves, I engaged this practice to become more Buddha-like, more free and have less suffering and so forth. And now I find myself struggling with issues that I thought I put away a long time ago. maybe a sense of, well, what's wrong with me or what's going on. And in some cases, with some folks, this is a showstopper. I begin looking for some other practice. And what's arising is what needs to be seen and felt and healed. But oftentimes, more often than not, it arises almost right next to these transcendent, light, expansive moments of peace or joy or love or whatever. And oftentimes I'll hear students say, well, what's wrong? What did I do wrong? Or why is this happening? It's a little bit like, perhaps like an archaeological dig. The archaeologist will dig up some materials, and when it shows up, we don't know whether it's treasure or trash. We don't know whether it's some sacred object or it's a piece of junk, because it's all underground, it's all buried. So the practice is to stay open to whatever arises, to not push anything away, not be attached, clinging to anything. But when working with the shadow, it's important to understand that there is a perspective that's quite important. And that is that working with the shadow is a way of reclaiming a part of ourself that we have rejected in the past. It's not opening up to something brand new necessarily, but it feels like it's new because it's been buried for so long. Just to create a metaphor, and I don't know how accurate this is, all metaphors are incomplete, but just imagine that you live in a house that's 2 stories with a basement, only you've never been aware of the second story. You only know the first story, the first floor. And you're only dimly aware of the basement. You remember being down there a long time ago, and it was very dark, dirty, smelly. You could hear things crawling around. And you didn't want to stay there. So you slammed the door shut and locked it. And so you live somewhat comfortably, perhaps, on this first floor. But then as you discover meditation and spiritual practice, you start poking at the ceiling, and you discover that the ceiling opens up and there's a floor above you. And it's a huge, big, wide, expansive room. And as you explore the room, you see a huge treasure chest. You get very excited. You run over to the treasure chest and would open it up, but to your dismay, you find that it's locked with a padlock, very heavy padlock. So you look around for the key and it's nowhere to be found, searching all over for that key. Because you can sense there's something very valuable in that chest. And there is. There's a hidden treasure. But how to find the key? So as you're rummaging around looking for the key, you find a note. And the note says, the key is in the basement. Well, there's the good news. There's the bad news. We know where the key is, but we need to go get it. So as we get our flashlight and hold our nose, begin rummaging around the basement, we find that we have to clean out the basement before we can find the key. So we find all sorts of dead things down there. Lots of family mementos. Pictures we haven't seen for a long, long time. And maybe even some pictures and some memorabilia from our ancestors. Things we've never seen before. And so, to clear out the basement, we have to pick these things up. And some of them don't feel too good. But we manage to pick them up and carry them outside into the daylight, one by one. And as we do this, the basement begins to clear out. We can search around with the flashlight, and eventually we do find the key to the treasure. And so that little story kind of illustrates the process many of us go through in our spiritual work, that we discover something, or if we don't experience it, at least we intuit that there's something within that's much, much more than anything I've experienced. We feel called and pulled upward, so to speak. We feel called and pulled to be bigger, to be more. And to our dismay, we may find ourselves feeling much smaller and more restricted in dealing with desires or emotions or memories that feel very regressive and non-spiritual. So what do we do with all of that? Well, sometimes this material can be very intense and overwhelming, or feel overwhelming, maybe very painful. So sometimes it's helpful to get professional help, to get a counselor, psychotherapist. But in terms of our meditation practice, what do we do with it? Well, essentially the same thing we do with everything. We notice it, we open up to it, we let it go, but not too quickly. And here's where there is a bit of a shift, because in working with shadow material, working with material that we've repressed and rejected, it's important to not let it go too quickly. We have to own it, claim it, and recognize that this is part of me. No, it's not eternal. No, it's not ontologically real. But it's part of me. And I need to own that that's my personal history. There can be a tendency to take the spiritual bypass. And this is true in every practice. It looks different in various traditions. In Buddhism, it can look like, well, there is no self, everything's impermanent. So I'll just push this away as quickly as I can. And that doesn't work. So the letting go really happens by itself when it's ready for us to let it go. We have to own and accept all parts of ourselves, and then we can let them go. If we try to release something that we have an aversion to, if we try to spiritualize it, say it's not real or it's impermanent or something like that, that can be dangerous because it's a way of trying to use the practice that's not skillful, not wise. So always awareness, always opening and accepting. But at the same time using discernment. Sometimes something may feel too big to work with right now. We need to sometimes hug it before we release it. Carl Jung said that we don't become enlightened by chasing the light, but rather by embracing the darkness. Embracing the darkness doesn't mean clinging to it, it doesn't mean wallowing in it. It doesn't mean believing the stories the mind tells us. It simply means feeling what we're feeling, being willing to experience what's here, to love and embrace those parts of ourselves that seem unlovable and are those parts that we don't want to hug or embrace. They may feel very frightening or very disgusting. So this is very powerful work. And we live in an era where we have Western psychology at our disposal. In the ancient teachings, the traditional Buddhist, Hindu teachings, virtually all of the spiritual teachings come out of an era where psychology was basically unknown. But we live in an era where we can use and incorporate psychological knowledge in our spiritual practice. So that's a wonderful gift, and at the same time it's important that we stay awake. The first of the Eightfold Path is right understanding, wise understanding. So working with the shadow is a very important, very powerful part of our practice. And, I think I've said enough for this morning, so I will stop. And thank you for being here. Thank you for having the courage to look within, because it is something that not enough of the human population is doing today. And it's greatly needed in our world for us to wake up, to become more conscious, and to love ourselves and others as well. And may your journey be guided and blessed by the Dharma, by the Buddha, and by the Sangha.